Tom had done a documentary on Harry Dean Stanton, and so we got to know each other, and the late actor, and became friends. Been amazed by his work. He's done documentaries on Harry Dean Stanton, on Sam Peckinpah, the director, on Merle Travis, the musician, the writer Robert Penn Warren. He did other documentaries on Nick Nolte, the actor, and so forth, Warren Oates. And he's won awards along the way, Emmys, and he's also, I just learned you won the Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. So that's pretty good. I know you're proud of that. But anyway, Tom, I wanted to ask a few questions, and I'll turn it over to the audience here. One question is, it's one thing to make a documentary on a famous actor. You've got film clips. You've got you've got a lot of action potentially there, and what have you, or a musician and so forth. But to do a documentary on a poet, was that sort of a special challenge of its own in putting this together?
Well, it was a special challenge in that regard, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to be able to somehow try to make the poetry come alive. And I was very fortunate to find readings of Mr. Warren's work by Mr. Warren. So then it was a matter of trying to capture visually the poetry of the place and the time represented by the poem. So that was, it's certainly more of a challenge than cutting to a film clip that illustrates everything and then you come back to your A-roll on camera narration. So in that regard, it was more challenging.
Yeah. One of the great, I think, themes of this film is Robert Penn Warren's evolution as a person, as a Southerner, from conservative upbringing to being a member of the Fugitives, the agrarians of Vanderbilt, where they hark back to an earlier South, an agrarian South that in a sense was sort of looking backward rather than looking forward. And then with his novel about the Southern demagogue who promises great things to everybody, but then ultimately becomes intoxicated by his own power. I had a chance to meet Robert Penn Warren back in the 1980s when he became Poet Laureate, and I asked him at a press conference, and I asked him, are there other Huey Longs out there, other Willie Starks? And he said, well, of course there are. And I'd be curious, what do you think Robert Penn Warren would say about the politics of today?
Wow, that's a loaded question. He would have a lot to say about politics today. He might start with the cliche that history repeats itself. That might be a beginning. He would certainly be disturbed about an attack on the democratic process, whether it comes from the left or the right, because in All the King's Men, yes, Huey P. Long was coming from the left, and out of his tenure there in Louisiana, bridges were built, roads were built, schools, hospitals. But the way he went about that was not the way you do things in a democracy. And so he would have a lot to say, and is probably now considering some kind of resurrection in order to be able to pick up that pen again, because there's a whole lot to write about.
One of the amazing things that I've seen in watching a number of your documentaries is I'm just very, as a lifelong journalist, I'm very impressed by your ability to get to sources, and really key sources for the people you're making a film about. And in this film, people like Harold Bloom, I mean, one of the nation's greatest literary critics and scholars and so forth, and others, family members talking very intimately about their father, and friends and so forth. In other films, many of your films have been about Hollywood and stars and so forth. I've just drew a quick list here: Chris Christopherson, Billy Bob Thornton, Michelle Phillips, Richard Dreyfuss, Benito del Toro. How do you get to all these people? How do you get them to talk to you?
Well, that's part of the whole process that I find so fascinating and intriguing is how do you work your way into worlds that are so much different than your own, but not just, I want an autograph or I want this. I want you to sit in front of me and participate and collaborate in a film and to trust me with what you say. And sometimes, in this case, I started with Rosanna Warren. And after I had secured her trust, the doors started opening. So here's Harold Bloom's home phone number. Here's David Milch's home phone number. And then things spread. And once you have that trust, once you've secured that trust, it makes it a lot easier. In other instances, such as the very first documentary I ever produced, it was on a character actor from Kentucky by the name of Warren Oates. He was in a lot of Sam Peckinpah films, a lot of TV, a lot of Westerns. People might know him from the film Stripes as the crazy Sergeant Hulka in a more popular vein. But Donnie Fritz, I got a hold of in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, songwriter and singer, and he played in Chris Christopherson's band for 22 years. So after we meet and after I interview him, he calls up Chris Christopherson and says, "You need to work with this guy." And so Chris Christopherson not only ended up being in 5 of my films and sometimes being in the film and narrating them. So you just have to work connections. In this instance, it was authorized. Once Rosanna's trust was secured, the doors flew open at that point.
You've done documentaries on a wide range of people and different sort of walks of life. What draws you to a particular subject, and what drew you to Robert Penn Warren, other than you're a fellow Kentuckian?
Well, I read All the King's Men as an undergraduate at Center College in Kentucky in 1981. I should have said 91, but I don't think anybody would have thought that. So it was 1981. And the book just had a lasting impression on me. And I read other works of his, some poetry, other novels. And then after our most recent presidential election, I thought it was time to read All the King's Men again. And it struck me, this is the perfect time to make a documentary about Robert Penn Warren. And luckily, I've made a lot of independent films, but I've worked at Kentucky Educational Television, the PBS affiliate in Lexington, Kentucky, for 20 years. And so when I'm able to secure approval for a project of this nature, all the personnel is supplied, all of the equipment is supplied, editing, production, everything is at my disposal. And so that makes life a lot easier as opposed to an independent project where you have to go out and hustle. You have to raise the money yourself. And that's a lot more complicated, particularly when you get into copyright issues. I have a documentary right now that I'm developing on low-budget film noirs. And I've found 15 spectacular prints of old film noirs that, for various reasons, have fallen into the public domain. So that documentary, because I do not have to pay for copyright, I can make for $90,000, which seems like a lot of money. But I've also optioned a book by Stanley Booth called The True Adventures of the Rolling Stones. Stanley traveled with the Rolling Stones for a couple of years in the late 60s. The book culminates in Altamont. And so in trying to raise funds for that documentary, I will spend $500,000 or $600,000 just on licensing issues, just on licensing TV shows, so forth. In this instance, I had to pay quite a bit of money to license clips from Dick Cavett. Because unlike, let's say, Truman Capote or Tennessee Williams, who would show up on every talk show at every opportunity back in the 60s and 70s, Mr. Warren was a very private person. So there wasn't a lot of material. So when I did find it, I knew I had to secure it, and that meant licensing it.
Yeah, that's great. We don't want to make this too long. Any questions from the audience?
Yes, ma'am.
Did Rosanna and Gabriel have the final word on your documentary?
No, I can't go into a documentary without having the final cut. That's just a losing cause. Now, what I do, I submit these. I say, when I have this thing cut together, I'm going to send it to Rosanna and you, Gabriel, for you to look at. And if there's something that's just inaccurate, something just plain wrong, I want you to have an opportunity to tell me so that I can correct it. But as far as stylistic choices and other choices, I have to retain that, or I'm not going to do it. Yes?
I was curious about that period, that dry period of 10 years, where he wasn't able to write poetry. As a novelist and as a poet, was he active at the same time as a novelist and a poet, or were there periods where he devoted more time to poetry and less to being a novelist, or was the novelist period more focused all by itself? So, was it all meshed in together, or were they separate periods?
It's funny that you bring that up, because he was talking about his dry period in poetry. And then, of course, during this quote-unquote dry period, he writes All the King's Men. So, his notion of a dry period is much different than most of our notions of a dry period. But he did bounce back and forth between poetry and the writing of novels. He didn't just exclusively do one. Now, if he was writing a book of poetry, it might be 3 months when he's on an island outside off the coast of France, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be writing another book of poetry immediately after that. He would intersperse novels. And it has a lot to do with his personal life, that dry period, because he was on the tail end of a disastrous first marriage that's alluded to in the documentary, but I didn't. I go pretty light on the TMZ angle in my documentaries, but it was a disastrous. Disastrous first marriage, and I think the poetry and other writing, but especially the poetry, blossomed simply with his personal happiness and his wonderful second marriage and his 2 beautiful children. And I think things blossomed for him.
Right back here.
I'd like to say a word in defense of Huey Long. I think it's unfair. I don't think I need that. I'll be loud. Okay. I think it's unfair to compare him with the current demagogue in the White House. I heard in the movie he says 4% of the people in this country own 85% of the wealth, and that's not good. It seems to me that he was serious about that, not only about the bridges and roads and schools and hospitals, but really about sharing the wealth. And he also told the Ku Klux Klan to get the hell out of his state, which took some courage then. I wonder if you know the T. Harry Williams biography of Long. It doesn't hide his faults, but it gives a more positive picture of him than Warren does, even in that novel, though Warren was so often criticized for taking Huey Long too seriously.
Well, it's interesting, the points you make there, in that in one point in the documentary, I wanted to make sure to include John Burt saying he did not necessarily think that Huey Long was all that bad a guy in many respects. And so I think that's, and I also show a clip from 1985 of Mr. Warren showing his admiration for Huey Long about how brilliant he was in a 1-year law course and then taking the exam. And so there is actually admiration for Long in some ways that comes across in the documentary because I wanted to be fair. But, you know, when you have a bill coming up in the legislature, like Mr. Long would have, and there was one key vote that you needed that he couldn't get, and he would have the state police pull that legislator over for speeding 35 in a 45-mile-an-hour zone and put him in jail long enough for the vote to be over. You know, there's issues there, and I think that can go either dependent. Doesn't matter if it's left or right. You know, that's no way to do business.
One of the most dramatic moments in the biography is when Mason Spencer, who was, you know, part of the Bourbon machine, but not willing to have anything to do with assassination, said, I think, on the floor of the Louisiana legislature, if you carry this thing through, you will ride with the white horse of death. And, you know, there is that aspect to him, too.
Yes, it's a story that I think is worth revisiting and worth keeping in mind, you know, as we move forward. And also there was, no matter how you look at Governor Long or his fictionalized depiction of Governor Long, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, there's an undeniable charisma there that is very important.
You make a very good point. That book by T. Harry Williams made me want to be a political reporter. That's a fascinating book, and fascinated by not only Huey Long but Earl Long, and they fought against an entrenched oligarchy that controlled that state, and it is said in your documentary they had practically no paved roads. They had nothing for the people at all because all the money went to the hands of a few. So that's part of the Huey Long story too. Very much it is. Any other questions?
Yes.
It's often the case in, or is it behind me?
No, you. And I wanted to make sure you get your question next, ma'am.
I probably won't need this either. Oh, okay, we're recording. It's often the case in current documentary practice to counterbalance both a positive and negative response to the subject in order to more fairly narrate, so to speak, or to take a balance of the material and then possibly earn a sort of lionizing towards the end. I felt, I was moved by this film, I want to say that, but I did feel that I knew the lionizing was coming. Was there a time when you sort of fell in love with the subject, or you wanted to make this more of an ode to Warren?
You know, I often go in with it would be an outright lie to say that I go into these projects without my own set of prejudices or likes or dislikes. And yet, when I start asking questions and I start getting responses, I try to allow the people whom I've assembled, and I try to assemble from a wide variety of sources, I try to let them tell a story. And then I go back in the edit suite and try to figure out what these people are contributing. Because everybody's going to have a certain leaning and a prejudice. And I also try to slip in things that if you're watching carefully, you see where there's cracks. Like I was very careful to include here when Dick Cavett said, "You've changed your views on race." And you could see Mr. Warren getting really uncomfortable. And he was saying, well, the Supreme Court believed this and anthropologists believe this. But, you know, I wrote this as a boy because Cavett was pinning him on the Briar Patch essay. Sit under your own vine tree and wait. And so you could tell Mr. Warren stiffening up. And Mr. Warren said, oh, well, the Supreme Court and sociologists and anthropologists thought this way. And then I thought this way as a boy. Well, my math is not great. But in looking at Mr. Warren's date of birth and the publication of that essay, he was about 25 or 26 years old. He was not a boy. He was an adult. And so, you know, I put in things like that to show that there's contradictions in people and try to tell the story. And that's also a reason why I do not have a voiceover narrator. I write the narration to guide you by the nose. That's not included here. So I wanted to allow those people to tell the story, and then I try to come up with something in the edit suite that's coherent and watchable.
I think maybe just one more question, if there's one.
Oh, this woman had her hand up, and I don't want to.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
And if there's any other questions, there's going to be a reception afterwards.
Exactly.
So if you have any questions that you weren't able to squeeze in during this session, I'll be out there probably by the Tito's vodka bottle. You'll find me. So it'll be easy to find me. You can ask me any other questions there. Yes, ma'am.
I was just curious, looking at today, is there something that you're just itching to, a subject that you're itching to get into next, aside from maybe the Rolling Stones?
Well, those two that I mentioned are the two that I have that I really want to make. The documentary on low-budget film noirs that I alluded to earlier, which I'm hoping I can get because it's so less money, resources required. And then I've been working on this adaptation of Stanley Booth's The True Adventures of the Rolling Stones for 3 years. And the budget is $900,000. And so all I have to do now is bridge the gap between the 900 I need and the 0 I have. Once I bridge that gap, I'm off to the races.
Stanley Booth is an amazing writer. His book, Rhythm Oil, is one of the classic books on roots music in this country. And Tom is going to go visit with him. He lives in Memphis, going to visit him tomorrow, and he's going to actually introduce me to one of my heroes. So I'm looking forward to that.
And before we conclude here, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the University of Mississippi and this department for bringing me down here, and to all of you for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.